Welcome to this episode of Fuelcast TV. I'm your host, Ian Murphy. Fuelcast TV is where we talk about all things freedom, unity, entertainment, and liberty. This episode is kind of going to revolve around a little bit of all of this. Last week, our wonderful governor here in Michigan, Whitmer, had a What's Next press conference to kind of discuss a few of the things that her administration would like to tackle in the second half of her tenure here. So she came out with this plan last week, and she was in this location that's called the Lansing Shuffle. And I thought it was just kind of funny when I heard it. And I actually thought it was a euphemism at first, and then I realized that was actually the name of the place that they were hosting the day's events. So right there, I just kind of thought it was awfully entertaining, awfully tongue-in-cheek right from the get-go. So I'm going to try and make this real quick today and get through a couple of these points here. She had four points that she was trying to make in her What's Next address from last week. The health of the people, health of the planet, health of the economy, and health of our democracy, which all of those topics, I think everybody can agree that those are some good topics to discuss. Moving forward, sorry, I got a frog in my throat here. Moving forward, those are some pretty broad topics to talk about. And then she breaks down further each one that she's talking about. Paid family leave, 100% clean energy standard, rolling back some licensing and regulations, and then the health of our democracy, talking about some of the things that are going on with Secretary of State and Proposition 2 and some of those other things. So I figured real quick, I'd kind of give my point of view, not that I'm running for governor, or that I ever plan to run for governor, even though last year or whenever we did it, kind of a tongue-in-cheek April Fool's joke, which I quickly had to point out was an obvious joke. Otherwise, I would have been in violation of campaign finance laws. So here we are. The health of the people. She comes out and she's advocating for paid family leave, paid family medical leave, paid family and medical leave, whatever, FMLA, which is kind of a funny moniker to have. But so some other states have these. I believe 10 or 11 states have them. This policy. And really what it is allows, I mean, it does a number of things, but it provides for maternal leave, paternal leave, when having a child. If you've got, if you're caring for an elder adult in your family, in-laws, those types of things, it does provide for, I think, up to 12 weeks, in most cases, 12 weeks of paid family or medical leave. Now, so I did a little bit of digging into this to see exactly what it is. My understanding is, I think at the federal level, there's some paid family medical leave. And then again, also some states have them. So state paid leave laws are insurance products. So I went out and found, this is from Center for American Progress. State paid leave laws are insurance systems. Employees, employers, or both pay into the system through payroll contributions, a payroll tax, typically a percentage of wages up to a cap. Then when workers need benefits, they make a claim and the insurance system pays them out those funds rather than the employer paying out of pocket. That should be pretty self-explanatory. Like I said, 11 states have passed a family medical leaves. California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Massachusetts, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, and Washington State, along with DC. Now, New Hampshire, I'm libertarian, so I always hear a lot about New Hampshire and what's kind of going on out there. New Hampshire has enacted a voluntary law that provides paid leave only to private sector employees private sector employers or employees who opt in by purchasing coverage. Imagine that choice. So instead of mandating that everybody participate in this paid family medical leave, they give the option. And again, it's either way, it's an insurance program that you pay into. So again, you're requiring somebody to do that in most circumstances, actually. In 10 or 11 of these, situations. And then you have New Hampshire, who offers 11 states. And then you have New Hampshire, who offers an optional system based on the insurance program. Great. So the question becomes, why do we need a statewide payroll tax for only some people that are going to use these benefits? Now, I'm not saying that these benefits aren't useful. I'm just saying, like insurance, you're not always going to use those benefits. So why not offer the option to voluntarily take part in this system? So that's where we're talking about paid family medical leave is for the health of the people. That's where she was coming from. So I'm looking at these things and I say, okay, well, this is an additional payroll tax. And when we're looking at what's going on in Michigan right now with our economy and everything, what I hear all the time is groceries are expensive, gas is, the cost of living is outrageous. And at the end of the day, if you enact a family medical leave, FMLA, here in Michigan, more people are not going to be receiving the amount of their net paycheck is going to be smaller. Now, granted, they might be gaining some benefits that they could potentially use at some point, or they may not. But what we know for a fact is that payroll taxes take that chunk first, and then you get what's left over. So essentially, FMLA is a raise in our taxes. So my employees, myself, I'm a W-2 employee, I'm going to see less money upfront from my paycheck versus, so for example, in New Hampshire, if I decided that I would like this benefit, I can go to my employer and say, I'd like to opt in to this FMLA and have those benefits should myself or my wife need these benefits. So to me, it seems like a needless, at times when our economy is struggling in Michigan and people need more money in their pockets right now, this to me doesn't seem like the best answer, at least at a mandatory level. Again, the option to take part voluntarily seems like an awfully good way to go. Otherwise, it just seems like a giant tax grab, in my opinion. And we know how well government are stewards of our tax dollars. They are not very good at it. So next comes 100% clean energy standard. Regardless of what date, what timeline you put on 100% energy standard, there are this could be its own podcast in and of itself. This is such a ridiculous thing to come out and say 100% clean energy. First of all, it's difficult for me to even have this conversation without laughing my ass off, because there actually is, in my opinion, and we can have a debate about this all day long, but in my opinion, there is no clean energy until we've figured out a way that takes less energy in than the output of energy that it is creating. I think there's some promising hydrogen technology out there, but my understanding is it's not quite developed yet. But clean energy is a joke. It's a hoax. It does not exist. Renewable energy does not exist. Solar and wind are a complete misnomer when you try and include them as renewable sources of energy. Now, I was looking into this, and I've felt this way for a long time, that solar and wind should not be perpetuated at a government large scale. I believe if that's something that you want to participate in, personal wind turbine generators, and we've seen small scale solar panels on homes somewhat effective. So I was digging around to find some more information, some up-to-date information that I'm biased already. So I'm looking out there trying to find some stuff. Maybe there's something wrong with the way that they're looking at these things. What am I missing? So I actually came across a recent article and some fascinating information about how the standard measuring methods when talking about the cost of building new, for example, wind farms or solar farms or a new nuclear plant or a hydro dam. And it's interesting that I found an article where they're kind of talking about how the way that they call it the levelized cost of energy is how they measure it, and I don't pretend to know enough about it, but let me see if I can find exactly. So this, I guess, is kind of the standard how they look at coal-fired plants versus solar farms versus wind farms, yeah, nuclear plants, blah blah blah. Um, building them, getting them through regulations, uh, the cost of building the components and mining the components and building the blades for solar, and the amount of concrete that's required for hydro dams and even nuclear, as well, all has to be considered into this environmental impact, right? Because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to be 100% clean, and we're trying to find the best ways, to not be oil dependent, right? Apparently, that is many environmentalists' point of view. Even though oil, simply put, has lifted more people, that energy source has helped lift more people out of poverty than ever. I'm not saying it's the best. I'm saying that's just the facts. So I started looking around, and I found the U.S. Energy Information Administration, USEIA. On their website, I found some very interesting information. Forbes has an article in 2021 talking about the carbon cost of renewables, and a really interesting article by Mackinac Center for Public Policy from 2022 by a guy named Joshua Antonini. Hopefully I got that right. So I'm kind of looking at all this information and kind of putting some of this stuff together. And I'm figuring out that the way that they're costing out the estimate, the average cost of various forms of energy is a little skewed. And it's not exactly on par with the truth, I guess. So a lot of things, so levelized cost of energy to estimate the average cost of various forms of energy. Now, this group called Lazard, leading investment and asset management firm, right? So they're in it for the money, uses LCOE to estimate the average cost of various forms of energy. Lazard found that utility scale solar and wind is around $40 per megawatt hour, while nuclear plants average around 175. Because the LCOE, the levelized cost of energy, is often used to argue for renewables against nuclear. This is where they're saying, look at how expensive nuclear is, $175 per kilowatt hour, per megawatt hour, versus 40 for just wind. Now, this is the cost of various forms of energy. Nuclear is so expensive. So wind is not. Utility scale wind is not. So they go on to argue that this LCOE is actually is flawed. The way that this measurement system is designed doesn't take into a lot of these other factors when building a wind farm and having to forge the blades and these other things, the chemicals that have to be mined in order to use photovoltaic cells for solar, right? So wind and solar is the two that environmentalists tend to go to as, quote, renewable sources, unquote. So here's the US EIA, Energy Information Administration, talking about the chemicals in photovoltaic cells. These are hazard chemicals used to make photovoltaic cells and panels that must be carefully handled to avoid release to the environment. Some types of PV cell technologies use heavy metals, and these types of cells and PV panels may require special handling when they reach the end of their useful life. Some solar thermal systems use potentially hazardous fluids to transfer heat, and leaks of these materials could be harmful to the environment. Again, this is our own government that is saying photovoltaic cells, whether on a small scale or large scale, contain heavy metals and hazardous chemicals inside them. So imagine a storm comes through like we had here in Michigan last week, which we'll talk about here in a second, and your PV cell, your solar cells become damaged. Now they're leaking chemical all over, or whatever it happens to be. Now you've got a whole other situation that you have to deal with besides not having these as other essential services. So it's safe to say that in its present form, solar cells, whether on a mass scale or in a small home versions, they have hazardous chemicals in them. That's the way I'm reading that from our own government. It goes on further to cite kind of what kind of chemicals. There's several end of life issues, right? So what happens with these photovoltaic cells once they go bad? Do they just go in the ground? Can they be decommissioned? How do you decommission them? Yeah, can these chemicals be used again? Blah, blah, blah. Great information there talking about solar. This is, again, where our state government wants to go, wind and solar. We do have some hydro dams in Michigan, but we're moving away from nuclear, and it seems we're moving away from coal-fired plants here in Michigan as well. So that's solar. Solar has bad chemicals. We can just X out solar. So let's talk about wind for a minute. Wind farms. There's an interesting article. I think this is Forbes. Yeah, Forbes article from April 28, 2021. Christopher Hellman. They're talking about how green is wind power really. A new report tallies up the carbon cost of renewables. How green is wind power? Again, this is where the LCOE, that levelized cost of energy, is a bit skewed. Building and erecting wind turbines requires hundreds of tons of materials: steel, concrete, fiberglass, copper, and even more exotic stuff like neodymium and dysprosium are used in the permanent magnets. So we've heard some things before about issues with these large-scale wind farms, with the magnets that are used in these. We've also heard things about what happens to these blades that are mainly forged and made out of metal. So there is a cost of smelting or burning or whatever that process is to make these metal blades as well. So it all has a carbon footprint, and that's sort of what this article in Forbes is kind of talking about. They go on to discuss, Siemens, citing data from the likes of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, Vestas, Siemens, Gamesa, Renewable Energy. The biggest contributors to the carbon footprint of wind turbines are the steel, aluminum, and the epoxy resins that hold the pieces together, with the steel tower making up 30% of the carbon impact, concrete foundation 17%, and another 12% for the fiberglass and the blades. Now, hopefully over time, they figure out different things and different materials to use and processes that'll make the carbon footprint smaller. If that is ultimately the goal, is to lessen the carbon footprint, which in turn leads to more greenhouse gas emissions, which they say is what is leading to more climate change, climate disaster, and now what they're calling more extreme weather events. More specifically, they go on to talk about wind turbines average just 11 grams of CO2 emission per kilowatt hour of electricity generated. That compares to 44 grams per kilowatt hour for solar and 450 grams for natural gas, and a whopping 1,000 grams of coal, for coal. Again, that's just kind of what they're talking about, the carbon cost and output there. But beating them all, beating all of these, is the original large-scale zero-carbon power source, nuclear power, at 9 grams per kilowatt hour. So what that is saying is, out of all of those, once they're up and running, that nuclear is 9 grams of CO2 emission per kilowatt hour. So that right there tells me we should be building more nuclear power plants. And there's a reason why we're not building more nuclear power plants. We can have a conversation about special interest. We can have conversation about donations, political donations, who's receiving money to talk about what. But at the end of the day, what we have to look at is what our government is proposing is to move to 100% renewable clean energy resources, whether it's by 2030, 2040, 2060, whatever, 3000. You simply cannot get there by using forms of energy production that take a ton of energy to create them, first of all, but then also aren't the cheapest as with regards to emitting carbon into the atmosphere per megawatt hour that is being produced. So by far and away, nuclear has to be part of that conversation. Stop talking about more wind farms. Stop talking about more more solar panels out there. That stuff needs to be put on pause. There's more to the conversation when we're talking about how this LCOE is used and the inadequacy of solar and wind. We saw it, the issues with our power grid in southern Michigan last week. I believe there were 7 confirmed tornadoes in Michigan last week, and I believe the stat I had was about 500,000 people were without power. There's I came across something else interesting. I got to pull it up while I have. So Axios just today came out with an article just talking about how unreliable Michigan's power grid and power system is. As a matter of fact, they're saying that our power outages are double the national average, and we have the sixth highest state in the country as far as power outages are concerned. None of that was mentioned in her address last week. It's ridiculous to have a conversation about trying to move towards 100% clean energy, but not at least assess where you're at. We have work to do, right? That's what leaders say. This is where we're at. We have work to do. This is where we want to get. Now, I'm taking issue with where she's saying we want to get 100% clean energy. That's just complete nonsense. You'll never be 100% anything. So that's just ludicrous on its face. So then when you go even further, you're going to talk about other things than nuclear, which is actually as close as you're going to get to being clean. Is it completely safe? No. Is it wildly more efficient, effective, and reliable than all those other ones? Yes. Is it proven to be so? Yes. Look at France. France has done it. The other part is, so this actually kind of ties into next topic was the health of the economy. And her big thing was to actually say we want to roll back and streamline the licensing processes. Now, she kind of is mentioning large-scale manufacturing operations, and I'm not sure if she mentioned it or not. I'll have to go back and look. But so Goshen Inc. is looking to build a Chinese-owned battery factory, I think in Big Rapids and mid-Michigan area. And there's a lot of issues surrounding that we don't even have time to get into. There hasn't been an environmental impact study done. There's a lot of just a lot of stuff going on around that is not very transparent at all. So she's talking about streamlining the licensing process for a lot of these projects like this, which I'm not a big fan of regulation. People know I'm not a big fan of licensing to begin with. So naturally, as a libertarian, I would be completely in favor of streamlining this process. Now, given those issues that I just previously mentioned that they seem to be skipping over, I have a real issue with this administration saying we want to streamline the licensing process when you're not being transparent about the current licensing process that's going on with some of these other things. So I worry about that. Now, let's talk about nuclear and building new nuclear plants in the United States, regardless if it's in Michigan or not. And Michigan might have just decommissioned one maybe a week or two ago. But I've got some statistics here somewhere where it's talking about, well, here's a factor that, Michigan, right? We've got this beautiful environment to protect, land, water, all these amazing resources, but nobody wants to talk about how many acres it requires for a solar farm to go up, a wind farm to go up, versus a nuclear power plant. And that's what this article is also talking about from Mackinac Center. Levelized cost of energy doesn't take energy density from each form of electricity. The subsequent environmental impact of the facilities themselves, right? So when you're driving through a large wind farm, it's hard to miss. When you're driving through a solar farm, they're relatively hard to miss. A lot more cities are starting to incorporate them on parking decks, which again I think is a great idea. We still have the issues with what happens with their whole end of life cycle. A wind facility requires more than 140,000 acres, 170 times the land needed for nuclear reactor. Okay, most people are familiar with Michigan. We're surrounded by water. We have two peninsulas, so we kind of have a limited amount of land to be putting wind and solar on. So there's one. A wind facility is 170 times more land than nuclear to generate the same amount of electricity as a 1,000 megawatt reactor, according to the Nuclear Energy Institute. The Institute notes that while nuclear requires 103 acres per million megawatt hours, solar needs 3,200 acres, and wind uses up to 17,800 acres. So just merely by an acreage standpoint, nuclear clearly takes up far less amount of land, even if you put it out, solar or wind turbines out in the lakes. That's still taking up acreage, right? That's a big deal. People don't talk about that. That is a big deal, right? We only have so much land here in Michigan. It further goes on to talk about the average LCOE for existing coal is 41 megawatt hours. Combined cycled gas, 36 megawatt hours. Nuclear, 33, and hydro at 38. Less than half the cost of wind resources or new PV resources with imposed costs included. So this is going back to talking about how the LCOE is actually upside down. And is just shouldn't be used as a unit of measure when talking about energy. So we need to throw away the LCOE is really what needs to happen. So it's a misrepresentation for the cost of solar and wind as too low, and puts the cost of energy as too high, is really what it is. There's some interesting things in here that this article talks about. The Japanese nuclear power plants take an average of 3 to 4 years to build. Then when we come to the United States, so they also mention in here France. So the French take 5 to 8 years. So Japanese 3 to 4, France 5 to 8. Then we get here to the United States and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and their 32-step process. I want to say it's like 10 years. Something like that. Yeah, American plants used to build at this used to be built at a similar pace before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission began to regulate the most minute aspects of construction. Contemporary American nuclear plants commonly take over a decade to build. The NRC has a 32-step licensing process. It further goes on to talk about it's actually the NRC is the one that makes it difficult. So while even a state regulatory agency can be cumbersome, the NRC, the federal level, takes over and can make it even more difficult. It looks like it here is telling me that like on the state level is an average of 4 to maybe 6 years. So the states can get it done. It's the federal agency that's going to make it take longer. And again, that goes back to streamlining the licensing process. So again, health of the environment, health of our economy, kind of run perpendicular to each other on this situation here. So let's streamline the process to get some more nuclear power plants built and online. Let's get them going now, instead of waiting on parts for power plants, solar power plants, and parts for wind turbine generators. We know there are issues with birds. We know there are issues with insects. We know there are lots of issues with, and some of these articles talk about that, but we don't even need to talk about that here. Some of the spectrum of light that is being bounced off of large scale solar arrays, yada, yada, yada. Again, I'm going to advocate for personal wind turbine generators. I'm going to advocate on part of the health of the economy. Let's set up an economy where I can put a personal wind turbine generator up or multiple on my homestead or affix it to my house and allow me to sell my excess energy back to the power grid. So imagine hundreds of thousands of little wind turbine generators out there that are offsetting your own energy use. But now I'm incentivized, not by the government, not by tax subsidies. Now I'm personally incentivized to keep my lights off during the day because I just might be able to sell some of my windmill energy back to the grid that I'm going to get a check to. So we need to start thinking outside the box. And this is already happening. This is not something that is that crazy to do. This is already happening in other states where you can sell your excess energy back into the grid. This is a great option to start here in Michigan, and we can get it done. Now, I know there are a lot of hurdles, and there is a lot of money involved with not allowing some of these things to happen, but let's be honest. I would be completely open to doing that, knowing that while I'm at work and the wind is blowing, or if I get solar panels on my home, that the combination thereof, I can exceed my energy usage and send it back. Now, maybe it's just a couple dollars a month, maybe whatever it is, but on a large scale, every homestead now contributing to this power grid could be a very powerful thing for us moving forward on a energy scale, an energy grid scale, and an economic scale for all of us. Not even speaking of commercial use, sitting in downtown Gaylord here, we've got 3-4 story buildings right here. Why not put some solar panel wind turbine generators up there and allow these commercial properties to start selling energy back to the grid as well? So we've got health of the people, health of the planet, health of the economy, and the last. And the last one she talks about is health of our democracy. I don't have a lot to talk about on this one because there's so much going on in Michigan with Jocelyn Benson, these alternate or fake electors or whatever you want to call it, whether or not Donald Trump is going to be allowed to be put on the ballot here in Michigan is some more rumor that we're hearing. That the Secretary of State may remove Donald Trump. So it's hard to have a discussion about, the health of our democracy in Michigan with some of these things going on. There's always questions about elections, but when the ruling party comes on and said this is the most secure election in our history, and then it turns out that there are signed ballots fake ballots that were, the whole thing going on in Muskegon, right? I'm not even going to get into it, but let's just say that this was not the most secure election. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but there certainly are some things that happened in this last election that just didn't add up. And I'd like to see a transparent investigation of this whole thing, and I honestly just don't think it's going to happen. But so what the governor was talking about in her address last week, the health of our democracy, mainly was around the implementation or the passing of Proposition 2, and then its subsequent implementation. I sat in on a county commissioner meeting, I think it was maybe last week or so, and our wonderful county commission was having discussion, and our county clerk made some remarks about the upcoming election cycle and implementing new Prop 2 guidelines. Excuse me. And specifically, they are concerned, as well as the townships, about the 9-day early voting. And not that it was or was not a good idea. It was a matter of staffing. It was a matter of the availability of the township hall or wherever they were having their voting. And there was discussion about city hall being used and each clerk contributing, or each township contributing a clerk or two for the various, because it's 12 hours of voting for 9 days in advance. And you can have a discussion about, whether or not that's proper, improper, whatever. It's not what we're here to talk about. What I found interesting was the concern being relayed about the staffing issue for 9 days of early voting, the coordination of that 9 days and those clerks in those townships, and then the discussion around, well, I guess I shouldn't say discussion, but the relaying of worry around ballot boxes, and then the subsequent surveillance, the cameras that then have to be implemented. It might be 2026 at those cameras. I'm not sure on the date on that, but so I've been reaching out to more clerks to see if they have the same worries, the same concerns, and how that's going to be run when we've got an election that seems like it's far away, but let's be honest, it's about a year away. And these are things that are not easily remedied, and they're a big deal. So this is where I think the discussion needs to be about the health of our democracy, is starting at the smallest of locales, the little villages and the townships that have to deal with 9 days of early voting, the ballot boxes, and then securing those ballot boxes with cameras. Those are all the things that need to be discussed because they need to be done. If we're going to promise these things, now again, we can have the discussion about whether they should have been promised or not. That's fine. But this is now law, and our township clerks have to abide by this law and have to make sure that these things are implemented, certain things by next year and then others by the following 2 years. So I think that is really a discussion that needs to be had, is how are we going to help out these township clerks to make sure that they have the proper funding to make sure that they can meet these statutory regulations that Proposition 2 set forth. And that's really not what they wanted to talk about in the next step address that the governor had last week. They just kind of want to talk about, a little bit of a pat on the back, saying, look what we did, and the voters passed it because this is what we pushed forth, and the voters spoke, and this, but not much in how they're implementing it and how well it's going implementing those things. Now, it might be going well in other districts and other locales, but if it is, we need to know what those winning strategies are so everybody can get them in place, so everything is on the up and up, so we can attempt to have the most transparent election moving forward, because there is some severe integrity issues going forward at a lot of different levels of government, with the health departments at the state level and the local level. Obviously I've had my issues. None of them are severe. We are suing our local health department again. But really what it's about is looking forward and looking at what this current administration is proposing for the health of the people, the health of the planet, the health of our economy, and the health of our democracy. And really, what she should have been talking about with regards to the health of the people is making your own decisions. Whether or not you're buying into the new COVID strain, or whether or not they're going to use mandates again for climate change or environmental stuff. The health of the people should be actually discussed in the fashion of the health of the people, not a policy that is a payroll tax to give some people paid family medical leave. Now, I'm not arguing for or against the program. I'm just simply saying this is a payroll tax that they want to pass, and people need more of their money now rather than a what if situation down the road. Again, I'm going to advocate for allowing the option to take part in a program that it's insurance anyways. The health of our planet, there is no such thing as a 100% clean energy solution. We need to be looking at nuclear. It's time to stop talking about wind. It's time to stop talking about solar. It's time to start talking about nuclear, build nuclear, deregulate nuclear. Look at our allies that have been building and using nuclear successfully. It is the closest thing that you're going to get to clean. It's the closest thing you're going to get to renewable. We need to start doing it now. And the leadership in this state needs to start talking about nuclear energy. Put down the bullshit about clean and renewable and pick up the idea of nuclear power is the future. Get the special interest out of the way. Let's talk about having the capability for me or for my neighbor to build a personal wind turbine generator or personal solar power panel package, that's a lot of P's, on their home to sell excess energy back to the power grid. Imagine if we had not had some of those power plants in southern Michigan that had to run on backup power. Imagine if we were able to direct some of the excess power being generated from northern Michigan to help out our brothers and sisters in lower Michigan. That's the kind of forward thinking that our leadership has to have in Michigan if we're going to talk about a a healthy economy and a healthy environment in the same situation, in the same discussion, right? They're one in the same. And then the health of our democracy, there is a lot of conversation moving forward that is happening in real time with the health of our democracy. And all I can say about this is I've been trying to say it a lot lately. Think globally, act locally. If you're concerned about anything that's going on with an election, it happens locally. Go to your township meetings, go to your city councils, go to your county commissioners, talk to them. They are your neighbors. They're the ones that are going to tell you the truth about what's happening. Some news article from Detroit Free Press quoting somebody that you've never heard of is not as personable as you going and actually having the conversation about your concerns about 9 days of early voting, and if that's actually going to be possible, if that's what you're an advocate for. Again, I don't really care. I think more access to voting better in most circumstances. So I don't agree with like anything that came out of her mouth regarding these four topics when she gave her what's next address last week. Also, I find it wildly entertaining that this is the person that had the gall, if you will, to come out and talk about the health of the people. This is a governor that hasn't faced the music with some nursing home things. She's not had her feet held to the fire with a lot of the COVID mandates, a lot of the mask mandates. She has in her administration a Secretary of State that has violated some election laws. She has violated a couple of Second Amendment laws. with regards to guns at polling places. She has a Secretary of State, a Attorney General that has allowed the governor herself to use two unconstitutional laws that destroyed our economy, destroyed many, many people's lives during the COVID pandemic. So it's very interesting to me that these 4 topics came out of this person's mouth. And of course, she's not going to backtrack and talk about the things that she did bad. Of course not. But it's worth a leader taking stock of where they're at currently, admitting that some things aren't perfect, and then moving forward where you're currently at. So if you're trying to move forward on some things, but you can't have a rational discussion about where you're currently at or the things that you may have contributed to where your current level is at, notice education was not talked about, even in the health of our people or the health of our economy, because again, those are intertwined. When we're talking about 3rd graders that can't read, we're talking about 4th graders that can't read, we're talking about 7th graders that can't do math. These are problems. Me as an employer, I'm concerned about these things. I don't have kids. My wife and I don't have children, but we do have nieces and nephews that are going to be going through this school system that she didn't even discuss in the next steps of her education package that was given record-breaking per pupil funding and couldn't have the wherewithal to say, we have work to do. Now, I know why she didn't, but let's be honest and have an honest conversation with the voting adults in the room, because that's what this whole thing sounded like. The Lansing Shuffle at the Lansing Shuffle last week, trying to basically haul this nonsense over and just gloss everything and make it sound like, well, we've done such an amazing job up till now. Here's the amazing job we're going to do for you moving forward. So those are my pieces of information for you to disseminate however you feel. Thank you for listening to me ramble on about this nonsense. Again, I'll post all the links to this stuff, the Forbes article, the EIA document, as well as the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. All great information to kind of help you understand exactly where we really need to be talking about moving our economy, moving our people, moving our our planet. Really, the state of Michigan is really what we're talking about. Again, think globally, act locally. I appreciate you guys hanging out. Appreciate you tuning in. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Please don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell as well so you know when any of our stuff comes out. Head on over to locals.com as well. Subscribe for $5. Helps us move forward, and all this stuff that we get to do helps us fund our lawsuit moving forward and everything as well, and gets you access to our new docu-series / pod Q-series that we're going to be releasing here in the next month or so. I'm sure we're going to drop in a little clip of that somewhere if we haven't already. So thanks for tuning in. Again, freedom, unity, entertainment, and liberty is what we like to talk about here on Fuelcast. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.